David Smith. I now spend most of my time as a business consultant, mainly in the areas of engagement and high performance. I mentor chief executives and HR directors, and I do quite a lot of business speaking. I use my experience of my career as a case study. I talk about practical, real things, and I do it by storytelling. I don't work full time. I spend quite a bit of my time climbing mountains. My intention in my 50s was always to move into a different gear, have a portfolio life. So I do a bit of non-exec work, and I do quite a bit of working with businesses, and I enjoy every moment of it.
So David, you mentioned that you based a lot of your stuff now on your experience and a case study, and what a case study it was. Could you talk us through the story?
Well, when I worked at ASDA, which was a 15-year stint, which is quite a long time, I went to work in a business that was basically bankrupt and broken. I think a burning platform was a tremendous opportunity to actually try lots and lots of things. It was a completely new board, a new management team, full of ideas and wanting to actually make a difference to a business that had been badly led for a lot of years. So a lot of the things that we did were experimental, they were leading edge, and it was an opportunity to turn around a business and get it back on track. And it was a very exciting time. And I think,
an unusually receptive environment for those sorts of new ideas.
Yeah, I think when you're at the cliff edge and you say to people, let's kind of walk away from the cliff edge, it's quite powerful.
Yes. And
I think people want to believe and they want to move to a better place. And I think it's incredibly powerful in those circumstances to try things and learn from them. And then when you look back, you realise that some of those lessons are very powerful, not just for what happened there, but for lots of other businesses too.
Now, when I heard you speak the other month, which is when you and I first met, you were talking about the old command and control structure, which was very much the norm in the old days at ASDA. So talk us through that. What do you mean by that?
Well, command and control structures emanate from the military. They seeped into the sort of world of business around the globe because, lots of the map was coloured pink, and the British Empire pervaded itself into how style has developed. So it's not just the old ASDA retail business that was a command and control business. Lots of businesses are like that. And I think command and control is there because it works in crisis. But I think in lots of businesses, and particularly as time moves on and people have become more educated, and employees question what's going on and want more from their leaders than just to simply obey, there's a need to actually sort of rip that out and say there's got to be a better way. And we certainly felt in the ASDA business we had to change the style because it was a style of fear. It was very overbearing. And people were very turned off by it.
So did you feel that people were very constricted because they only did so much?
Yeah.
Or they did what they thought they were expected to
there was
do?
a real sense of don't bring your brain to work, don't bring your soul, just bring your arms and legs and lift boxes and tick things and
Sure.
do the process that we've asked you to do.
Yes.
And that doesn't get you anywhere. It certainly doesn't get you differentiation. It doesn't get you high performance. And it doesn't get you the best of the individual because they just come as a shadow of their real self.
Now, if I remember rightly, you have extrapolated 7 guiding principles which you've implemented in the ASDA experience.
Yeah.
And one of those, perhaps the first one you mentioned, was the hiring policy.
Yeah.
They hired on experience.
Yeah, the whole of retail, and largely still does, looks for experienced people who've worked in retail before because people will know what to expect. They think they'll be easier to train. They'll know they're going to have a pretty rough rota with some evenings and some weekends, and they'll know it's going to be low pay, hard work. But actually, if you merely employ people who've worked in the retail sector who know what to expect, you'll certainly never stretch yourself. And we wanted to turn that on its head and say we want to hire for attitude. We don't care about experience at all. We can teach you what you need to know in a very short space of time. We really want people who enjoy being with the customer.
You describe them as gobby people that you hire.
Yeah, I think that there are 2 types of people, aren't there? There are degrees of extroversion and introversion. We wanted extroverts.
Yes.
Because actually, if you're going to sit on a checkout for 4 hours, it's pretty dull in terms of the work content.
Yeah.
The enjoyment is meeting the public and chatting about what they've bought or what's happening with the weather or what's happening in the world or what their children are doing or whatever.
Yes.
And if you enjoy that interaction, you'll enjoy that 4 hours.
Of course.
And so will the customer.
Of course. I love your story as well about dealing with absenteeism. I'm sure you remember the anecdote that you told about the lady who admitted to something which perhaps was rather odd.
Yeah.
So talk us through that one.
Well, that was in the context of listening to employees and getting ideas that management can't think of. And I was talking to people about how we would reduce absence in the business. It's a common problem in all businesses. All businesses have people who go missing for whatever reason. And this lady's idea was, why don't we, the management, let them, as the workforce, swap shifts? Many of them worked less than a full-time rota. Many of them had issues with childcare, and this lady was talking about the fact that often when she rang in sick, it wasn't her that was ill at all, it was her daughter.
And was there an interesting pregnant pause after that moment when she admitted that sometimes she wasn't ill?
Somebody might have leapt up and said, "You're fired,"
Yes.
But she was saying, if you let us swap shifts, what do you care who comes in which day, as long as there's sufficient workforce? And she was saying, look, we have to look after our children when they're ill. The guys will go to that all-important annual derby if they intend to go. They'll go sick. If you give them some degree of autonomy in terms of how they organise all that, it will work better.
Yes.
Now, when we tried to introduce that idea, the line managers were not happy.
Because that was their job.
That was about giving away control.
Yes.
And their view was, if they can't come in, they're damn well absent, and if they're absent often enough, we'll fire them.
Yeah.
Not very motivational. So we did introduce shift swap, and it brought down absence in the business by 20%. Now, no kind of management think idea could ever have changed the kind of Rubicon by that quantum.
But presumably they tried to reduce absenteeism by the traditional command and control processes.
Yeah. Yes. And I think sometimes we're so bound up by being in charge that we don't ask the questions of people, is there a different way?
So it seems to me that your philosophy was very much about empowering people.
Trying to empower
people, but did you meet any resistance, not just from the managers who didn't want their authority to be taken away, but also from people who weren't ready to be empowered?
Yeah, I think when you start doing new things, it makes people uncomfortable. When we started saying we're not going to use Mr. Smith anymore, we're going to ask you to call me David, people were uncomfortable about that because they felt it was changing their whole world. But after a while, that became, of course we do it that way. So I think when you first start to make changes, people are a bit gobsmacked and a bit sort of wary of what's going on. People are suspicious about giving their ideas or their thoughts because they say, well, if I tell you how bad it is, will you put a black mark on my record? Will I get myself fired? But eventually people began to trust the fact that wasn't going to happen, and then the ideas really begin to flow.
And there was another idea I think I remember you talking about that came again from the shop floor staff. Something to do with flowers and containers for flowers.
Yeah. Well, this was a lady who sold cut flowers in our stores, and we were talking to her about our operation, and she was saying, the flower buyers are really good in what they do. They're running a multi-million-pound P&L. They source their flowers around the world. The bouquets that we're doing are really great value. They last well in store. They last well in the customers' homes. She was very happy with the way the buyers were running the operation. And yet, she said, we're insane. So we said to her, well, why do you think we're insane? And she said, well, the flowers come into store in black plastic buckets. They're brand new. And when we've sold all the stock through, we throw the buckets away. What an insane waste of money that is. We're a retailer, why don't we dry the buckets and sell them? They're brand new. It made the business £500,000. And the flower buyers would never have got that on their agenda because they were concerned with the P&L and the sourcing and the colours and the offers and so on. Yes. They weren't thinking about, for heaven's sake, what they were delivered into store in. So I think the perspective of the person who actually is at the bottom of the organisation is just as powerful as somebody who sits at the top.
Indeed. And what were the sort of outcomes, the measurable outcomes of these? I mean, you mentioned one there, that was a measurable outcome, but what sort of other outcomes did you notice, both of a financial nature, but also non-financial?
Well, I think one of the immediate outcomes when we began to hire the right kind of people was the customers noticed. And customers notice great service, and they tell stories about great service, and it's word of mouth that flies around the communities. And that starts to increase footfall. And footfall for a retailer is pure gold. If you can increase footfall, you will increase revenue. So changing the Rubicon on who we were hiring was noticed immediately, and that began to shift our customer perception scores, which we measured weekly. And on the back of that, it also had a surprising effect on the internal workforce that was already there, because we found that by hiring really great people, folk inside were going, wow, someone's really doing something quite smart here. and it caused people to raise their own game.
Yes.
And I think because the business began to get the customers taking notice and raise its game and drove footfall, we then saw sales climbing, which eventually kicks its way through to profit.
Yes.
So there was a real sense of a virtuous circle of hiring the right people, getting customers to notice, which drove sales. And the business performance began to climb.
But it's like turning the tide in a way, isn't it? Because the tide's all going one way now. There's a momentum building up.
Yeah. And it began to make it feel like a business that could not only get out of bankruptcy, but that could actually be a real winner.
Yes.
And we went very quickly from being the sick man of Europe, if you like, to being a world-class business.
Yeah.
And these things take months and weeks and years to build, but once you've got things going in the right direction, it starts to build.
Sure.
And we began then to tell stories about our successes.
Yes.
So where we got the customer validation stories coming in, we began to tell people and say, look, this is a great example, this is another great example, and those stories begin to live in people's minds.
So did you, because we're very interested at Mojo Life in the idea of developing a story culture within an organisation, did you find that you had to help the employees to recognise a story when it came up?
Yeah.
That's something that they'd done. Did they start to capture them because they recognised them, rather like a journalist would do?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a real sense in which we asked people to send stuff into us, we asked customers to write into us, and you get the odd drip every now and then. But when you do, you have to actually take that and put it on the wires and get all your line managers to say it on a regular basis to people so it gets known. Yes. So you have to actually encourage it and fan the flame. And I think then you get some people who naturally are storytellers who will run with the ball.
Yes.
And you get others who are less good at it, but it's worth fanning the flame, I think.
But I think I suppose what I was getting at was a lot of employees, it seems to me, don't realise the quality of what they're doing because, well, that's just what I do, isn't it?
It's the ordinary job. Yeah.
And you've got to extrapolate. So, well, actually, what you've done there is extraordinary.
Yeah.
Is it?
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of people would say, well, that was just my job and I've always done that. And we would say, no, that's actually really quite exceptional. That's why the customer has written to us. That's why we've heard about this and we want to say thank you.
Yes.
So it's getting people to realise what is actually extraordinary as opposed to what is just my job.
Exactly. You have written a book.
I have indeed.
ASDA Magic.
Yes.
And from your experience at ASDA, this extraordinary case study, you've extrapolated these 7 sort of guiding principles. Yeah. Could you just relate to the audience what those principles are?
Very simple, really. And when people hear them, they will say, well, this is just common sense. What I would say is common sense is pretty rare. And these are the things that people forget to do. So we've already mentioned hiring for attitude. And then training for skill, as opposed to getting people with experience and getting the sort of common things that the rest of the industry do. Secondly, learning to communicate until you're blue in the face. All organisations communicate. What I hear is that most organisations communicate pretty badly, and I think you've got to get through the noise of daily life. Life is so full of information. We are data rich, and we are full of information, but the messages from business rarely get through, and you have to keep communicating until you're sick of hearing your voice to get through to people. Thirdly, you have to listen to people throughout the organisation, and I think most executives ignore the feedback that's going on, sometimes undervalue it, sometimes don't realise how powerful it can be, sometimes actively want to avoid it, but there's tremendous power in listening to people. And it really engages people in the business when you listen to them. It's the highest form of respect. The fourth principle was all around changing or selecting an appropriate style of management. In ASDA's case, it was moving away from command and control to what we defined as challenging and involving people. But I think you really have to decide what style you want in the organisation and get people to live it. Otherwise, you get mavericks in the organisation who bully people and create fear and do all sorts of outrageous things because no one's told them what the appropriate style should be. My fifth principle is what the world calls performance management. I hate that phrase. I use the phrase remove your underperformers and push your talent. People forget about pushing talent. And I think a great organisation really pushes people early. We had a policy of taking risks on people and giving them opportunities before they were actually really ready and supporting them through, but also to give those opportunities to move people out of the way who weren't performing. Sounds a bit brutal, but I think most organisations expect the leadership to do that kind of stuff, to do career planning and to give people opportunity. My sixth principle is all around recognition. The world obsesses with remuneration. which clearly is important, but it's not the be all and end all. I think we forget to say thank you and have ways of saying thank you for exceptional performance.
And of course, Dale Carnegie, that was a central part of his concept, wasn't it? Showing appreciation.
Yeah. And recognition really works. You know, we have a world where the Oscars is out there, and it's a big thing in the film world. We have people competing for the Olympics who get no money, but they devote years of their life for the sake of getting that gold medal. And then we ignore those principles in business because we think we have money instead. And what a mistake that is. And then finally, a kind of much more esoteric thing is deciding that the workplace should be fun. And getting people to have a sense of community and bring their concerns and their personality in. We talked earlier on about the fact that we don't access the full person. We make them something less than they are by confining them into a box called a job description. And what we try to do was to say, you know, this work is actually pretty routine and boring and pretty low paid, but we want you to have fun. We want you to enjoy what you do. We want you to bring yourself into the workplace and be yourself. And I think it really creates a different dimension if you can actually do that.
Yes. Now, we were talking before that you moved from being, you know, in an employed role to becoming a self-employed consultant.
Indeed.
And extrapolating those 7 principles has helped you to kind of brand yourself.
Yeah.
Is that it? Have you got any advice for people who are doing the same thing, you know, in terms of coming out of corporate life and setting up on their own?
Yeah, I mean, I think I had a long-term career plan to change my life in my 50s to a portfolio life and think about speaking and consulting and doing things. I think you can only give advice to others if you can actually frame what your learning has been. And I think one of the things that people should do if they're thinking of rebranding themselves or going into any kind of advice-giving role is to get some framework around their thinking and to understand what they've learned. What I find powerful when I meet chief executives or HR directors is talk about what works. Because people are casting around for solving problems in the workplace with what works. And I think, unfortunately, I used to hate consultants most of my corporate career because many consultants want to sell you a model.
Yes.
And that's the model that they're selling. Whereas actually people want a customized solution to their particular issues.
Yes.
And I think if you've got the kind of experience that's been valid in your working lifetime and you've learnt some lessons, it's about how you apply those lessons to the particular issue, the problem.
So I mean, you could say that your 7 principles is a model, but what you're saying is that it has to be bespoke. There's got to be a bespoke version that's right for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think in talking about the kind of things I talk about, I think I talk about those because they do crop up in organisations. They are the common sense things. But I think also some organisations are good at a few of those, but they have some real issues with some of the others. And I think you always find there's an area where there's a hole in what the management team of that organisation is doing.
Sure. Just wrapping up, David, is there maybe one thing that you've learned in all of your years doing what you do?
If there's one thing I've learned, it's that the people dimension of a business is the most powerful. And I'm fascinated that wherever I go, people have these statements on the wall in their mission statements or their vision or their values or whatever that says our people are our most important asset. And it usually comes last in the list, which kind of is kind of an oxymoron, because if our people are our most important asset, why did we list it last? And actually, if you can switch on your people and truly get them energized in a way that is exceptional or it's above the norm, it will make a massive difference to your business. And I think most people, when faced with that statement, would say, yeah, I think I agree with that. We don't live it on a day-to-day basis because we're too close to the knitting of what the business does or what its issues are at the moment, and we forget that important principle.
So if you get the people right within the organisation, then the level of customer service will kind of sort itself out.
I mean, Jim Collins in his book, Good to Great, talks about getting the right people on the bus, and then they will take the bus and drive it to the right place. And I fundamentally believe that. And organisations, I think many organisations conceptually would agree, but on a day-to-day basis we don't behave that way.
Well, David, there have been some extraordinarily inspiring but very clear messages in that interview, so thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
And I wish you well for your ongoing mission.
Thank you.